This is Sorrel Hillman of Time magazine, and we are about to launch into the 7th of 10 informal conversations with that distinguished man of letters, John Mason Brown, on the general subject of the humanities. And since, Mr. Brown, your most recent literary efforts have been taken up with the life, or I should say the many worlds of Robert E. Sherwood, I should like to turn the question in this discussion to biography and autobiography. Sir Sidney Lee said the aim of biography is the truthful transmission of personality. Do you agree with that, Mr. Brown?
I would say, Mr. Tillman, that that is only one of the aims. It's a partial aim of biography. It is one of the necessary aspects of biography, but let me say why I think it's only a partial aim. That says, doesn't it, the truthful transmission of personality. That, of course, could be achieved, and even has been brilliantly achieved, in profiles in the New Yorker magazine, where you have a pencil sketch rather than a full-length portrait.
Or a Time cover story.
Well, to be loyal to the house organ, certainly. And if you say truthful transmission, of course. But let's go back to the question of what is more than personality. Let's come to the complications of personality. You do remember, I am certain, Plato's famous image of the personality in terms of horses, of the black horse and the white horse, and that each human being was torn by the white horse and the black horse, one going downhill and one up. And that, of course, is the eternal conflict between good and evil, oversimplified. But the complexity of psychology, as we have known them in this post-Freudian age, and as Shakespeare knew them long before the benefit of couches, present one of the real problems to the biographer. You have to get the man, it seems to me, and the background.
Well, of course, I suppose you'd say that Lytton Strachey was really the key figure in the making of modern biography. In other words, before his time, David Cecil, who was one of the best of modern biographers, I think, has written that biography is not an important form of literary art, and that the biography of the past was not artistic, it was useful. It was written to give people information. But he says that Lytton Strachey wrote about Queen Victoria not to give us information about her, but because he thought her life was an excellent subject for a work of art, thus pioneered in the writing of modern biography.
Lytton Strachey did revolutionize modern biography, and Lytton Strachey is one of the supreme artists, and he insisted that biography cannot be an exact science and that it is an art form. He only pretended to speak for himself as an artist in terms of his selection. And I don't think there ever has been more brilliantly selected biographical writing in our times than in eminent Victorians, where he makes superb use of details. You remember, for example, the detail in Cardinal Manning, for whom he had no love, quite understandably. Do you remember when he described Cardinal Manning as horrifying the young priests at his church because during Lent the cardinal's appetite was such that though he confined himself to fish, he took 4 fish courses at a time. And one of the young men said, I regret to say, I think the cardinal has a lobster salad weakness. And that was the holy man's weakness. But the minute you had that appetite in Manning, who was a worldly prince of the church and a convert, at that moment you begin to get the insight into character and disclosure. I think Lytton Strachey was a romantic who loved costumes, who dressed everybody up to the hilt. Cardinals, nightingales, whether it's Kitchener or Elizabeth or
Gordon.
Essex, Victoria, Gordon, any of these. And then he loved to undress them spiritually. They were naked by the time he had done with them. Strachey himself complained, Virginia Woolf has complained, André Maurois, all of these people have complained that before the Stracheyan change in emphasis and the usage of the selective and ironic method, that what you had were these double-deckers or triple-deckers, these mortuary floats carefully brought out as official biographies to sort of massage the vanity of the survivors of a fairly indifferent man, or even to minimize the greatness of a great one. And he snatched that shroud of dullness of biographical writing and brought it to life. I must go to a question raised by Strachey himself. I remember in the war years sitting in at the Churchill Club, which is the old Westminster School in London, at a session on this very subject of biography. And the fine old English critic Desmond McCarthy presided, and Peter Quinnell
Oh, yes.
and David Cecil were among the speakers. And I remember how lustily Desmond McCarthy, who admired Strachey hugely, accused him of going beyond the proper limits of biography at the conclusion of Victoria. And I'll give you the illustration, then come to the point I'm trying to make. This is when the old lady, the widow of Windsor, is about to die, and says Strachey, as she lay blind and silent, seemed to those who watched her to be divested of all thinking, to have glided already unawares into oblivion. Yet perhaps In the secret chambers of consciousness, she had her thoughts, too. Perhaps her fading mind called up once more the shadows of the past to float before it, and retraced for the last time the vanished visions of that long history, passing back and back through the cloud of years to older and ever older memories, to the spring woods at Osborne, so full of primroses for Lord Beaconsfield, to Lord Palmerston's queer clothes and high demeanor, and Albert's face under the green lamp, and Albert's first stag, and Albert in his blue and silver uniform, and the Baron coming in through a doorway, and Lord M. dreaming at Windsor with the rooks cawing in the elm trees, and the Archbishop of Canterbury on his knees in the dawn, and the old King's turkey-cock ejaculations, and Uncle Leopold's soft voice in Claremont, and Lazen with the globes, and her mother's feathers sweeping down towards her, and a great old repeater watch of her father's in its tortoise-shell case, and a yellow rug, and some friendly flounces of sprig muslin, and the trees and grass at Kensington.
What a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, but it is one, as I think Cecil, Maurois, all of them saluted, and so did Desmond MacCarthy, as one of the beautiful poetic descriptions of what could be passing in Queen Victoria's mind.
Could be, yes.
Now we come to the point that I want to make, and that is what is, to my way of thinking, one of the errors there, if you take it as biography, serious biography, rather than a fine piece of writing, is the very usage of the word perhaps. You will notice that the word perhaps is used about 3 times in the evocation of Victoria's past as she moves further and further back in memory. And now it seems to me that one of the things you have to avoid, or should try to avoid in biography, is taking the liberty of guesses. You know sentences which do this all the time. And when I read in a biography, he must have known that so-and-so was true. I begin to say, well, no, not necessarily. It ain't necessarily so.
It's like the had I but known school of detective fiction.
That's exactly. There is a famous essay written years ago by H.L. Mencken on the death lines of the great, which has very much to do with biography and accuracy in biographical or even historical writing. He took such words as kiss me hearty, tell Emma that I love her, or Theodore Roosevelt's put out the light, and so forth and so forth. And then in each case, he looked up medical case history to see what a person still possessed of consciousness could have said at that moment, and usually could have just said glug.
Yes.
Because they were in a state of what we now call high sedation.
Well, of course, another classic example is O. Henry. Isn't he supposed to have said, put up the shade, I don't want to go home in the dark? Actually, further research indicates that he said, give me another drink of whiskey.
There are certain death lines. I want to turn romantic, if I may, for the moment, which should have been said, even if they weren't. Tell Emma that I love her, or kiss me hearty.
Nelson wishes he'd said that.
Well, the world, England needed to have him say it. That's the point. There are some lines that are just for national emergency, or the voice of this or that country. Let me go back to the question of the true transmission of personality. And this is in relation to background. Biography, at least as I have come to see it, is a very special form of writing. I know that, to my shame, that for years and years, I've taken the writing of biography, good, bad, and indifferent biographies, more or less for granted. I've come through personal experience to realize what are some of the trials, readjustments, and special demands of biography.
You mean your biography of Sherwood?
No, let me start with something much simpler. Let me start with the life I wrote for the Landmark series of Daniel Boone. Bennett Cerf. We ran into each other in Detroit, and Bennett Cerf said to me, I would like to have you do a book for the Landmark series. What would you like to do? And coming from Kentucky, I naturally thought, since I'd been brought up on every legend about him, that I knew the life of Daniel Boone. When I went to work, I discovered to my anguish that Daniel Boone lived to be something like 86 or 88, that he covered 5 major periods of American history, and that the research involved was really overwhelming for this book.
And that he'd never written anything himself. I mean, could he write?
Well, he could scrawl. He could write on trees. Killed a bar.
His bark was worse than his bite, don't you?
That's right. But the next time Bennett Cerf asked me if I would do something, I said, having written about a man who lived to be that old, from now on I shall write only the lives of people who die young, such as the Tsarevich. Let's come to what it means first in the interests of biography. One is narrative, and the other is the building up by detail or accretion, the sense of personality. Go back to the earliest biographers. Go back to Plutarch. Go back to Suetonius. And you'll see how different as they are, each of these men can make truly skillful use of detail. Most of us were brought up on Plutarch as the introduction to classical biography. Most of us realized that what he did was to write antiphonally about some of the men that he dealt with. He would take one great man, Alcibiades, and
counterpose him against,
counterpose.
exactly.
And you got what is one of the most reliable resources of the contemporary biographer, the sense of juxtaposition and contrast.
As the modern scholars point out, you have to read him with some caution in that Plutarch had very few sources at hand, made a lot of errors, and this is not to detract from his greatness, but he was writing really less as a biographer, I think, than as a moralist and a philosopher, whose interest in great persons was the extent these qualities could be illuminated.
Suetonius, in the lives of the Caesars, the 12 Caesars, is of course totally different. He too is writing from unreliable sources, but he's writing the first gossip column of our time. He's practically writing confidential. He's writing anything that he can for scandal, for horror, throwing in any detail against any of the Caesars to blacken them and make the reading easier. When it comes to having evidence at hand, I must admit, having now struggled first with the Boone, with many separate sketches, and now with Robert Sherwood, that I have developed a respect for Parson Weems, which I never had in the past. Never, never, never in the future will I complain about even the cherry tree story. That's the easiest way to write history, is to make it up, and that is to make the obligatory scene. But of course it shouldn't be called either history or biography.
Isn't it true that your chances of emerging with a really good biography are a great deal better if you've got a lot of source material? I'm thinking of that brilliant biography of Hugh Walpole that came out 2 or 3 years ago, which was as good as it was, I think, largely because the writer had masses of Walpole's letters and diaries to work with, and he was able to let Walpole, in effect, tell his whole story, and yet to bring him out as a three-dimensional character, simply because he had all the source material.
You come to letters and diaries, they are the very core of a biographical writing. Once you have taken out that quivering heart of the author himself, once you have seen the letter that wasn't meant to be seen, once you've turned to the diary that wasn't written for posterity, then naturally you have an insight that you can never gain even from daily contact with the person. I know this is absolutely true in the case, say, of the Sherwood, that I have poured now for 2.5 years over it was originally 30,000, it's now about 45,000 documents, all the diaries, the letters, and though I knew Robert Sherwood and admired him greatly, I only thought I knew him, because the Sherwood I now know, naturally, is an inner Sherwood that was not shown to the world. It was shown to his family, his wife, or his friends, and to each friend differently. You'll admit that if you write me a letter, or I write you a letter, the letters we write to each other will be based upon our opinions, one of the other, and the expectations that we think the other person would like. And therefore you get a whole man revealed as he writes to person after person. You get the many facets of his contradictory personality.
And is that true in the case of Sherwood? Does all sorts of facets of personality come through?
Oh, certainly, certainly.
Of course, that makes your task just that more difficult. Challenging, but more difficult. In an attempt to get all these out.
Well, there are so many problems, as Strachey was keenly aware. One is the question of the evolution of character. That is, as it changes decade by decade from experience to experience. Then there is the question, if you are dealing with people that you have never seen, of how do you see them, through whose eyes? May I give you an illustration which is, to me, always seemed to establish the point I'm trying to make. Henry VIII, if I say Henry VIII to you, the visual image that comes to your mind, the expectation that is in your mind when you go to see any actor play the part, is the Holbein portrait.
I must confess, I automatically think of Charles Lawton throwing the leg of lamb over his shoulder, but then Holbein too.
That was one way of getting even. The wives got even with Henry that time. But let me go back to the point. Don't forget, when you are reading the descriptions of whether it's Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn or Henry or any of the historical characters who have been painted by famous portraits, including the Holbein of Henry VIII, that what you are seeing when you encounter that printed page is, say, Francis Hackett's vision of Holbein's vision of Henry VIII. Now, if he can support from Henry VIII's letters or the messages sent by ambassadors at that time, the Spanish or the French, whatever it may be, or court observers, if he can support his own deduction from the reading of the face as read by Holbein, then we may be approximating the truth about Henry VIII. But the final truth, I suppose, will always prove elusive. There is no butterfly net.
The Hackett book, of course, is a classic of its kind, but I don't think anybody pretends that it is totally authoritative. There may be all sorts of sides of Henry that he hasn't been able to get out. Of course, in the case of St. Paul, fortunately, we have his own words. I think it's interesting that in Paul's letters, he signs his name so many different ways, unconsciously indicating, I think, the many facets of his own contradictory character.
Well, when you come to contradiction, that is not only the essence
Contradiction and facet of character.
Yes, but let me finish. Contradiction is not only the essence of individual character, including your character and mine, but contradiction is also the essence of all historical observation, biographical or straight history. I'm going to come to that distinction later. Take, for example, the life of Jesus. The four Gospels, if you read them carefully, and heaven knows they merit it, reading, rereading, and devout rereading, you will discover that the writer of each Gospel has a different personality, sees the same story in terms of different details, and it is only by combining the four Gospels that we get what is usually accepted as the story of Christ, the passion of Christ, from birth to the death. But each man is seeing differently, and it's by the combination of the observations from those different personalities that we get what is finally the established image in the Christian mind of Christ. At the present moment, for example, we are reading a good many books about the war. Almost everyone who has carried a gun or a star or anything else has written about the war. And most of us have been reading Montgomery's war memoirs. And I think one of the most wisely corrective things to prove the inevitable contradictions of the point of view and personality in biography, in this case autobiography, is to interrupt the description of a particular meeting, a particular war problem, or a particular battle with quotations from General Bradley's A Soldier's Story or from General Eisenhower's Crusade in Europe, so that you at least have the thing from three different points of view. And it is interesting to see, as in the case of the old and famous and tired illustration of the three blind men touching the elephant and describing it according to what they touched, the trunk, the tail, or the side. You have three different images of each of these scenes in terms of the personality of the writer and the experience. That's bound to be. Now let's take the establishment of personality while we're in the field of military writing. Let me go back to, I suppose, the classic example of all military writing, which is, of course, Caesar's Gallic Wars. Don't forget, that is not actually meant to be an autobiography. It seems to me to be more an official communique, to paint carefully for the consumption of the Roman public the image of Caesar that Caesar wished to establish.
Don't you think that the military memoirs are in for a revival anyway these days, not only because of the wars we've gone through, but because many of them are genuinely well written? I remember that at Harvard some 20 years ago, Howard Mumford Jones shocked a great many undergraduates by maintaining that U.S. Grant's personal memoirs constituted some of the finest writing in American literature. Today, critics as distinguished as Edmund Wilson agree with him.
Well, I don't see how anyone can deny that.
They did, though.
Well, they may have. It depends whether they're northern or southern critics. I would quickly add William Tecumseh Sherman, because I think his memoirs are just as good as Grant's, and they are written with that special kind of glorious clarity and conciseness which the military writer at his best has, and which Eisenhower also has in Crusade in Europe, and which Bradley has. As I remember this notable book on Sherman, The Fighting Prophet, he also brought out that Sherman, in spite of what people now believe, in spite of the march from Atlanta to the sea, Sherman, because of his terms with General Johnson, which were even more generous than Grant's, Sherman was someone who was admired in the South until they were looking for a scapegoat, until the memoirs came out, and until he attacked the generals on both sides rather roundly. And that's when they began to have this hated Sherman myth in the South of today.
That's because in Reconstruction days, he was as enlightened as Grant was.
Certainly. Now let's go back, let's leave the Civil War. It has been fought a good many times. And let's leave the land of Catton and proceed with the writing of biography. And one of the enduring questions, according to the best biographers, is if you are doing a life, how much of a Times should you give? How much background and how much foreground? I think you will find that such a practitioner, say as Virginia Woolf or Morawar or Strachey, the artist would say, the literary artist turned biographer, the true writer, that what you are doing in biography is painting a portrait. Therefore, the history of the times is no more than the background. Many biographers have pointed out that if you throw in too much history, you have destroyed your figure, because you wanted to highlight it exactly as you would have it hung at the Metropolitan in a gallery if it were a portrait.
Wouldn't you think that Hilaire Belloc was a classic example of the biographer who was at the same time a historian and who enveloped his subjects in history to show particularly how they influenced the course of events or how the course of events affected them? And that's what his main interest was.
Well, that raises a very interesting point, the personal point of view. How much can you exile from your writing what is a personal conviction? Hilaire Belloc did write from the Catholic point of view, just exactly as Macaulay wrote from the Protestant point of view. And you are bound to get an orientation from what is personal conviction or prejudice or whatever you want to call it.
Did that weaken his writings?
It certainly took away that divine impartiality which is supposed to be one of the
Which
aims.
is non-existent anyway.
It
of
never
course.
has existed. Never, never, never in the wide, wide world has it existed. But some people pretend that it has. Let me use an image. It may or may not be accurate. It's just popped into my mind. If, say, at the Metropolitan, the conductor allows the orchestra to play so loudly that it drowns out the singers, then an error has occurred. Now, if in the writing of biography, the historian takes over the biography to such an extent that you lose sight of the central figure, then I think this is the same orchestra conductor singer era of which I spoke.
And by the same token, a biography which virtually ignores the times in which a man or woman lived and his or her reaction to them is also badly deficient.
Well, as silly as those sexless Maxfield Parrish little things floating around on soap bubbles on...
Well, they're associated with clouds, at least.
But they have no earthbound reality. They have no truth. Now we come to the means of reaching truth. And may I come back down to biography in terms of a play rather than in terms of a straight biography. There was a time when people were perfectly willing, the French have always been willing, for example, to accept Corneille or Racine and the great abstractions. On the other hand, there have been writers who have insisted that Shakespeare's chronicle history plays are the best English histories to be found, which of course is absolute tosh from the point of view of factual
Certainly the best
observation.
pageants.
But they mean tumult of human nature as opposed to the cold abstraction. I think the interesting problem of the biography, everyone that we have mentioned, anyone that we can think of, is to try to deduce from the evidence at hand what are the inner contradictions showing that a man may be good. The white horse may win over the black in the Platonic sense, and we hope he does. But no man is all white horse, or hardly any. And one of the great problems of biography has been to deal with the virtuous, almost coolingly, chillingly virtuous character. I think that one of the difficulties in writing about General Lee, for example, has been that Lee was so above reproach that you do feel this chill of marble upon him. I think that is the same trouble with Washington. He has been so turned into a statue that he has ceased to be a man.
Now, biographers are beginning to find a few faults in him, and the biographies are improving.
Well, I won't say now, because in the debunking period,
Well, the Woodward
the
biography.
Woodward
of
biography
course.
tried to. But Mr. Freeman, now, in spite of all those volumes and all that research, seems to me there to have assembled the evidence without having selected it. The Washington is all there if you can find it, but it would take a second filtering for the real
stone
Washington.
cutter.
It depends how much you care for this detail. I happen to love the details in Freeman. But I'm still asking for the Strachey touch that will extract the Washington from this sagacity of detail.
Well, there I think you put your finger on another problem. One reason that Strachey was able to do that and Dr. Freeman wasn't, I think, is that Strachey had a marvelous, if acerb, sense of humor, and as far as I could tell, Freeman had none. Now, the combination of humorlessness and a character like Lee or Washington, neither one of whom was famous for his sense of humor, is a pretty deadly combination. Whereas Strachey could bring his own wit to bear on a non-witty woman like Queen Victoria and make her brilliantly vivid.
That was by exposure. He really showed up for what was a humorist, but I think we're missing one point about the Queen Victoria. I think, which is not as good a book, I believe, as The Eminent Victorians.
No, I agree with you.
But I think Queen Victoria finally conquered Lytton Strachey. The mood of Queen Victoria at the beginning is quite different from the mood at the end. He came to realize that beneath the bourgeois absurdities, beneath the underscorings in the letters, and the sentimentality, and the saving of stuff, and all this, there was the core of a great woman. And I think that woman, in her strength, with her limitations, emerges by the end of the book. To me, it's one of the most interesting conquests in literature, where someone has fallen in love half the way through. You often find it in a novel, where a novelist begins with the character, despising the character, and ends up by having fallen in love with that character. And I think Strachey, without falling in love, certainly gave full salutes to Victoria.
We haven't yet mentioned the classic of all, Boswell and Johnson.
There, of course, you have, by the consent of the world, certainly the reading and the critical world, the greatest biography in the English language. The reason always given there is Macaulay, as we all know, wondered how so great a fool could write so great a book. And Macaulay's point was that you had to be that big a fool to write so great a book, because you had to endure all those insults. You had to have that sycophant attitude, and you had to have the kind of humorlessness about himself which Boswell displayed on page after page of the Johnson. He was willing to take, and by taking, able to give.
I think you're being a little harsh on Boswell, because I think the Boswell papers are now beginning to reveal that Boswell had a good deal more stature than Macaulay ever did.
Oh, well, I think Macaulay was unjust to him. There's no question.
Otherwise, I don't think he could have done the book.
But I have read those Boswell books as they have come out, I've read them with fascination, admitting his skill, and I still think he's one of the snide little squirts of history. I have no admiration for Boswell at all, but I certainly have admiration for his gifts.
You remember what Fanny Burney said after the death of Dr. Johnson. She said, "Your friend, Dr. Johnson, sir, has had many friends busy to publish his letters, their memoirs of him, their views of his meditations and his thoughts. But I think he needed one friend more, a friend to suppress them."
Well, I suppose that could be said about almost anyone. There's never enough destroyed, thank heavens. Otherwise, the biographer and the historian would have a very hard time. I suppose the person most written about in American history is, by all odds, Lincoln. I suppose a whole library of books exists. Thousands. The Civil War is a period that has more written about it than any other period in American history. And I, myself, am thankful for every saved scrap of paper, because you never know when that scrap of paper will turn out to shed the final light of revelation.
Lincoln, of course, is an interesting case because so many people have seen him from so many different viewpoints that one of his best biographers, Benjamin Thomas, came out with a book several years ago about the Lincoln biographers, tracing Lincoln biography from the wartime biographies of him all the way down to Sandburg. Each person seeing Lincoln in a different light or in his own light.
Well, now you've come to another problem. That is, we all know the difference between biography and autobiography. We all know that the autobiographer, as a rule, is rouging himself just a little bit for history. Somebody such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau may say, "I will conceal nothing. I must tell the holy truth," and tell about his experiences.
Yes, he didn't confess all, though, did he?
I don't suppose any man can confess all, because he at least had a romantic picture of himself. He tried to be honest. It's one of the most amazingly honest pieces of writing in literature, but there was also an undercurrent of romanticism which helped to dictate the portrait.
Mm-hmm.
If the autobiographer is anxious to present himself in the most favorable of possible lights to history, I think it's fair to say that the biographer gives himself away in much the same way. The biographer, by the very thing he chooses to deal with, stands self-revealed, even as the autobiographer does, on the basis of what facts he chooses to slide over or to omit, or what scenes he decides to play up. Biographical writing is also autobiographical, and inescapably so, because the temperament of the biographer is bound to come through. It is a pity, perhaps it's best, I don't know, that Lincoln wrote so little about himself, but so much of him to himself in his actions, his deeds, and in the anecdotes.
But you remember when he did write his autobiography as a campaign document, it was a miracle of lucid, terse, precise prose.
It had absolutely no campaign ring to it whatsoever. It was very short and
unpretentious,
and alas, unfortunately, lacking in vividness from the point of view of what the modern biographer, including Lytton Strachey, would have sought for, or what the modern reader wanted.
Well, now that brings up a point I want to ask you about. How vivid, how anecdotal, how candid should a biographer be? The book I have in mind is that very controversial biography, Dylan Thomas in America, which I found absolutely fascinating. If you read it, you'll remember that the book is absolutely loaded with extremely candid anecdotes of Thomas's love life, drinking habits, and all the rest of it in America. He spares nothing. Now, a lot of people I know think that this was a shocking book, that it never should have been written, that he is indecently burying Thomas, who can't answer back in death. How do you feel about that?
I read that book with fascination and with some embarrassment. I read it with embarrassment, but with fascination for the obvious reasons. It's a skillful book. It certainly is a revealing book, and I think, according to the lights of the writer and the observations, a true one, as true as he can make it. There is always the question of time. When do you reveal? How long should you wait? Now, when the Lincoln papers were sealed by Robert Lincoln for those 50 years, or when Mark Twain wanted certain manuscripts withheld, that, it seems to me, is one form of ethical behavior that is worthy of admiration. I can only say, writing now about Sherwood and his circle and his friends, that it is infinitely harder to know what to write about the living than it is to write about those who are safely dead.
Well, you remember that after the Thomas book came out, his widow felt impelled to write her own version of Thomas.
I remember that, too.
Another thing, apart from time, is the question of taste. To what extent should you be motivated by taste in doing a biography?
Well, that is several hours in itself, Mr. Hillman, if we come to what is taste. It depends what the emphasis of the biographer is. Take Byron. If it's all lechery and lewdness and all this stuff, you have missed part of the real Byron. And the discrimination of the biographer, indeed his truth is to understand what is the poseur in Byron, what is the lover, what it may even have been the homosexual, as opposed to what is the great poet and the patriot.
But to leave out the apparently well-informed speculation about Byron's possible incest with his sister, again would be derelict on the part of the biographer.
Oh,
wouldn't
I
it?
think it would be absolutely incorrect. It would be unpardonable, because that would be a suppression of fact and a suppression of one of the facets of Byron's life and character. That's what you're after. But you're not there, I think, to write merely police reporting. You're not there to throw in every gory detail just for the sake of gore. And so much can be better said, as the great biographers have proven, by sparse, clean language rather than all this piling up of lush sob-sister adjectives. That's all I'm asking for. I'm asking for some respect for the language. The point is that because people write histories or write biographies, there is no reason to assume that they are writers. Now, the ideal biography is written by an historian who is an author, and an autobiography is written by somebody like, say, Lord Tweedsmuir in The Pilgrim's Progress, who is, after all, John Buchan, and
A professional writer.
and a supreme master of the English language. But what we are all looking for is not only taste, we're looking for writers who can write, and this is what David Cecil does preeminently, this is what Lytton Strachey did, this is heaven knows what Macaulay did, and this is certainly what Sir Winston Churchill at his best can do.
Of course, if we were reading an autobiography of Mrs. Roosevelt, we would read that not for Mrs. Roosevelt's style, but to obtain information, to obtain insight into her husband, don't you think?
We would read it not necessarily for style, but as its major emphasis, but I certainly think you would read it from the point of view of the pursuit of character.
Yes.
What Mrs. Roosevelt has to say very succinctly, very sharply about character, and from her own realism, her experience, fascination of her life in its fullness.
Of course, she is so candid that there's far less of a gap, it seems to me, between her own voluminous writings about herself and the books and articles about her that have appeared. They jibe pretty well.
I don't think anyone has ever written more honestly about her girlhood than Mrs. Roosevelt in that first volume of the three that she's done. I think the only person who's written as honestly that I can think of off the bat in English is Sir Edmund Gosse when he wrote Father and Son, which is one of the great honest biographies and pictures of childhood. What delights me in Mrs. Roosevelt is that when she seems to be most artless, she can be most artful. I think she's one of the shrewdest reachers for the jugular vein that I know of. I can give you an illustration, one that has stuck in my mind when she was describing the 1956 convention, at which she did not wish to be. It was very noisy in the convention hall, as always. And she listened to Governor Clement, and her one comment was, Governor Clement's keynote address proved that he had a loud voice. That was all. Now, that is a comment by the omission of
Yes.
comment. Can we go back to this question of the revelation of childhood? And let's get to autobiography as it spills over into the novel. You and I know that most first novels are almost always autobiographical, that somebody delves into his adolescence, thinking his adolescence or her adolescence has been different from any other adolescence. We know that writers have things within them that they must get out. Maurois, for example, insists that the mere writing act, in the case of Dickens, in the case of David Copperfield, which is, Mr. Maurois says, the warmest, most swiftly moving of the Dickens novels, he says that the reason for its warmth and the swiftness of its pace is that Dickens was exorcising all of the unpleasant details of his own childhood. Now, certainly,
That's why that's the best part of the book, I think, because when Dickens gets beyond that and has to do considerably more inventing in that book, I think that wonderful sense of identification is lost.
well, let me
To some
come to this
extent.
question of what does a writer write about, whether he's a biographer. If he's a biographer, we know what he's supposed to write about. If he's a historian, we know what his field is and what is at least his selected subject by his title. But suppose he happens to be the unconscious autobiographer, in other words, the novelist or the dramatist. Certainly Mr. O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night was a very, I won't say totally, but deeply autobiographical play.
Consciously.
Oh, I think deliberately, and this was the outpouring of self in terms of what had been the agony of his own days in New London at that phase of his life. Let me turn to another novelist, always autobiographical, and this was Thomas Wolfe. Certainly Of Time and the River and Look Homeward Angel and all the rest of them. You Can't Go Home Again. These are all outpourings of what were Thomas Wolfe's own experience. I remember when Of Time and the River came out, having been at Harvard and having worked with Professor Baker there, I remember reading Of Time and the River, as a great many students of Baker's and admirers of Baker's did, with consternation, because we knew that Baker had been very fond of Wolfe and extremely good to him. And this seemed such a shoddy expression of gratitude And I recall asking Thomas Wolfe once, why did you do this? He calls Baker Thatcher. And he says that to actors he looked like a professor, and to professors he looked like an actor, and all this thing. And I said, why did you do it? And Thomas Wolfe said, I did not write about Baker alone. I did not write about those people then in the workshop. I wrote from them. And his point was, if you can't write from the people you know, what do you write about? Do you make up people?
Well,
Now,
of course, this charge of autobiography against Wolfe made him acutely sensitive. And in his last couple of books, he desperately tried to get away from any suggestion of autobiography. You remember, he changed the name of his hero, Eugene Gant, to George Weber, and he changed his size, and he made a few physical alterations of the North Carolina landscape and so on.
But the same
thing was there.
volcanic personality was there.
But he tried to pretend it wasn't.
Well, he had had so much criticism on the other ground. I don't know whether this was justifiable criticism or not.
In his autobiography, Mark Van Doren quotes a great many of his own poems throughout the book and points out if they were poems about people, the actual people they were based on.
Mark Van Doren uses the poetry, interlards with the poetry, and uses it, I think, very skillfully to recreate in lyric terms what was the extension of his factual experience at a particular time. And as you say, in almost every case, he says this is a poem that was written from a mood, or this is written about a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the most charming features of Van Doren's autobiography is his account of his long friendship with Joseph Wood Crouch. And it's one of the happy friendships in literature, of two fine minds meeting, and then his devotion to his brother, older brother, Carl Van Doren. That is a wonderful picture of fraternal relationship. But in that autobiography, I think, for at least for my comfort, it dwells too much upon his childhood and the details in, I believe it's Indiana, and about his aunts and his uncles and whether they had hominy or cake or whatever it was for dinner. I wanted it to come closer to the crisis now when it comes to Columbia University, when he grows up, when he meets Joseph Wood Crouch, when he goes abroad, when he becomes part of the whole literary scene in New York and America. Then I think it gains naturally in interest. One of the problems in the writing of biography is to know what to do with the antecedents. Not only the uncles, but the antecedents.
As little as possible, I would think.
Well, it depends upon how much bearing they have upon a character. I suppose in the American tradition to deny family, and certainly it's in the Southern tradition, to crawl in and out of the family tree to swing yourself from limb to limb. Now, between the two, there must be truth. Mulwar says that he believes that the average biographer gives too much attention, and Hesketh Pearson says this in his very sensitive Life of Oscar Wilde, that the average biographer gives too much attention to the father and the mother. The family is probably of more influence on the child than are the two immediate progenitors.
I think in Pearson's own excellent biography of Shaw, he probably gives too little attention to the family, because once he gets that extraordinary mother of Shaw's to London, you almost never hear of her again. You have no idea how much he saw of her when he was no longer living with her, how she died.
When she was no longer supporting him, let's put it. But Shaw himself, of course, in the preface to Immaturity, to me one of the most sprightly and honest pieces of autobiographical writing that I know of, and certainly one of the most hilarious, is superb about his father, who was drunken, and his mother, with her tender heart, and this ménage à trois with Vandeleur, whatever the music teacher's name was. But that is part of the background, certainly. I think you have to have people start from somewhere. If you could only write the life of Pallas Athena, it would be fairly simple, because she jumped full grown out of that famous forehead. There was no question of family there. She was just a headache that turned into a goddess. But I know now with the Sherwood book, I'm struggling very hard to know how to control what is the necessary background. Certainly when you get the Emmett family, as opposed to the Sherwood families, you have two very interesting and contrasting sides of New York and American life, as well as English and Irish life. If you come into the story of Victoria, certainly you have in the background, when you approach Victoria, the four Georges of Thackeray, and you certainly have William. Well, you have the father, and you have this whole thing mixed up. You have to
in
have
any
something.
such biography as that, you'd have to put in a good deal of detail, I think. Without those antecedents, she wouldn't have been queen.
Well, that you can't tell nowadays. But you do have to have the sense of the background. The blood is something that is there as well as the environment. Now, this is when you come into environment, you come to the picture of times. This is where it seems to me you have to evoke the scene.
I suppose that in America, probably the two most famous autobiographies written are The Education of Henry Adams and The Autobiography of Lincoln Steffens. Now, in the...
Please don't forget Benjamin Franklin.
Well, Franklin, of course. But I was thinking in more recent times, both, I think, are almost entirely intellectual biographies. The growth of two minds. There are very, very few personal details.
I disagree. Let me go back over those books just for a moment. Let's start with Franklin, which is delectably homespun and simple, from the leaving of Boston and the coming to Philadelphia and the beginning of the career and the moral axioms. Then let's go and jump quickly to the education of Henry Adams. A great many people do not like that book, but I don't see how anyone could fail to admire it. It's a book that I read practically once every 3 years. As you remember, the device of the book is to refer to Adams as Adams. It is put into this third person. It is chilly in its dispassion. It is the end of the Adams family. It is the end of the American dream, is what he's practically saying. And he says it in terms of his own introspection. However, the book is so brilliantly written and so brilliantly observed that it seems to me a major contribution to American literature. May I come to Lincoln Steffens for a moment, which is a fascinating book in terms of education. I think you may have forgotten some of the details. There's a picture of a professor, I believe at the University of California, wherever Steffens went. Do you remember this teacher, one of the great teachers and one of the great pictures of a teacher? Do you remember the chapter when Lincoln Steffens' father promised to give him the pony?
Well, of course, that's classic.
I think that's an overpraised classic between us. I think it is, as we read it now, that is a sentimental indulgence. It's a very good story, and it will always be reprinted.
Well, it's a little Booth Tarkingtonian, perhaps.
Perhaps, but there's so many Booth Tarkingtons that it's hard to say which is which. But when you come to the professor, do you remember what he said about this teacher? He said, this teacher knew the important thing. He knew how to teach a class that the best book had not been written, the best action had not been taken, that there was always this future hope in the world for the thing that was being better. And that was the beginning of Steffens' dream. Then I think his descriptions of the police reporting in New York are simply extraordinary.
But of course, all of that's fascinating, and his account of Theodore Roosevelt and his muckraking and his pieces for McClure's on the shame of the cities. All I meant was that there's very little about Steffens himself in it.
I think that perhaps is true.
Our mention of the biography versus or juxtaposed with autobiography reminds me of the Baruch books, coming out almost simultaneously, Baruch's autobiography and the large biography of him by Miss Coit.
Well, it seems Miss Coit's prize-winning book on Baruch is a biography written by a fine professional biographer, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Calhoun book some years back. The more complete picture, of course, is to be found in Miss Coit. The more exuberant picture, oddly enough, is to be found in Mr. Baruch's own pages, which dance with the kind of militant self-concern, whereas Miss Coit is trying to probe from the documents a dispassionate narrative rather than a paean of happiness and self-congratulation.
Well, of course, I don't suppose any biographical subject, obviously when the biography is written of him while he's alive, could ever really be satisfied with a biography that's at all objective, because naturally he'd see himself very differently.
Well, there you come to the problems of the autobiographer. If the autobiographer is too modest, then people think that he's telling a lie. If he happens to have congenital modesty, and to be honest in stating it, then they think, oh, well, he's playing down. He thinks he's really better than
Either that or they just think he's a bore.
Or a bore. If, on the other hand, he is full of trumpets about himself, if everything he does is perfect, then his egotism becomes absolutely unendurable. There is a dilemma as to which extreme. Where is the happy medium between these two extremes?
Of course, the mere fact that somebody is willing to write an autobiography presupposes a certain amount of self-esteem or recognition of one's own importance. The classic example of the supremely modest man of our times who has refused to write anything about himself to date is General Marshall.
General Marshall, of course, is one of the great and modest men of our time and has refused to write, and I myself wish he had written.
And here I use the word great advisedly, I think.
I would certainly back you 100% in using the word great about General Marshall. I wish he had written, because I'm one of the people, as I say, who collects, who loves to read, and would love to have his point of view. He has chosen not to do so, so that is that.
We haven't yet touched on the influx of biography, and actually autobiography too, into the other realms, such as television and the movies. Don't you think it's interesting that so many more movies in the last 10 years have been biographical movies?
Oh, well, practically everybody who has been able to sing or breathe or dance or take liquor or take dope or anything, their life stories now are happy. To me, most of those are blatantly uninteresting because they are so removed from truth. They are practically film magazine stories just written for fans who, it's hairdressing material.
I think the movie that actually started the trend is still the best, Wilson. Darryl Zanuck's Wilson.
The Wilson film, I thought, was an extremely good film. On the other hand, I myself would much rather read Mr. Herbert Hoover on the ordeal of Woodrow Wilson than see a movie. This is again age. This is coming to the point when I want the actual document before me and the image of the man rather than somebody in makeup.
Well, inevitably, of course, the picture is going to be blurred once it gets on the screen.
Well, it's romanticized. The courtship of Wilson and Mrs. Galt, for example, was turned into straight Hollywood stuff, however cleanly played with the essential problems of Wilson's tragedy and the ordeal of his presidency. Let's come to the thing that we haven't touched upon at all, at least to my knowledge, and that is not only the portrait painting, detail by detail, which we have mentioned, but the scene painting, which is necessary. The wonderful thing about Strachey, Macaulay, David Cecil, any of the people we've mentioned, Francis Hackett, at his
Gamaliel
best,
Bradford, even.
Gamaliel Bradford,
at his best,
is the evocation not only of people, but of the sense of past personalities so brought to light that they live for us. And so does the scene in which they move. The scene has to be painted as exactly as if it were being done for the theater. You have to know it is the placement, the mood, the lighting. You almost have to have direction. There is that sense of production in the best biography, and that is, of course, what Strachey excelled at. We could cite instance after instance of brilliant scene painting and character evocation. May I turn, in conclusion, to what I think you and I both agree is one of the greatest scenes in the whole of literature, and this happens to be the death of Socrates. And I quote only the last paragraphs, wishing I had time to read all of these extraordinary words. Aside from the words from the cross and the glories of the Passion of Christ and the crucifixion, I know of no scene in literature, no death scene, as moving because of its extraordinary simplicity, because of Plato's refusal to overload with adjectives, and this Hellenic cleanliness of thought and expression. Remember that he has said this is when he has been tried and he has accepted the condemnation rather than the exile and has faced death by hemlock. And there's not a word used falsely in this famous passage. This is when the sun has set, when Socrates has gone to take his bath, when the man has come with the poison, and when he prepares to die. And even the warden says, I hope you won't blame me for doing this. I know you will not. They are angry with me, some of these other men, Socrates, and they curse me when I bid them drink the poison because the authorities make me do it. But I have found you all along the noblest and gentlest and the best man that has ever come here. And so he leaves the poison. And then they continue to talk for a while, and this is with the setting sun. Then Crito made a sign to his slave who was standing by, and the slave went out, and after some delay returned with the man who was to give the poison, carrying it prepared in a cup. When Socrates saw him, he asked, Understand these things, my good sir. What have I to do? You have only to drink this, he replied, and to walk about until your legs feel heavy, and then lie down, and it will act of itself. With that he handed the cup to Socrates, who took it quite cheerfully, Echecrates, without trembling, and without any change of color or of feature, and looked up at the man with that fixed glance of his, and asked, What say you to making a libation from this draught? May I or not? We only prepare so much as we think sufficient, Socrates, he answered. I understand, said Socrates, but I suppose that I may and must pray to the gods that my journey hence may be prosperous. That is my prayer. Be it so. With these words, he put the cup to his lips and drank the poison quite calmly and cheerfully. Till then, most of us had been able to control our grief fairly well, but when we saw him drinking and then the poison finished, we could do so no longer. My tears came fast in spite of myself, and I covered my face and wept for myself. It was not for him, but at my own misfortune in losing such a friend. And then Socrates says to them, I purposely sent the women away so that they wouldn't cry. I do not wish to cry. And the men were ashamed to be reproved by Socrates, and because of what they had done. He walked about until he said that his legs were getting heavy, and then he lay down on his back as he was told. And the man who gave the poison began to examine his feet and legs from time to time. Then he pressed his foot hard and asked if there was any feeling in it. And Socrates said no, and then his legs, and so higher and higher, and showed us that he was cold and stiff. Socrates felt himself and said that when it came to his heart, he should be gone. He was already growing cold about the groin when he uncovered his face, which had been covered, and spoke for the last time. Crito, he said, I owe a cock to Asclepius. Do not forget to pay it. It shall be done, replied Crito. Is there anything else that you wish? He made no answer to this question, but after a short interval there was a movement, and the man uncovered him, and his eyes were fixed. Then Crito closed his mouth and his eyes. Such was the end, Echecrates, of our friend, a man, I think, who was the wisest and justest and the best man that I have ever known. And there, it seems to me, Mr. Hillman, you have the perfect setting of the scene, establishment of the character without mawkishness, and that glorious, that supreme human detail, the Iowa cock to Aesculapius. It is like, pray you undo this button, as spoken by King Lear. The evocation of both spirit, man, and scene, which is one of the great purposes of biographical writing.
And of course, Mr. Brown, if ever the phrase classic could be applied to anything appropriately, it certainly is to Plato on Socrates as an absolutely classic biography. And it occurs to me in that connection that in our discussions, the word classic has been bandied about a bit. I'm not sure entirely correctly always. But it seems to me that if this is an overworked word, as it probably is, it still is one that needs more precise definition. And so during our next talk, I should like you to turn your attention to the whole subject of the classics and classicism and give us your ideas on what constitutes a classic.